we're good.
Hi, I'm here with Gary Mallaber. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, sir.
Now, you had started your career in a local band called Raven, and actually a live recording of yours got into the hands of some very prestigious rock groups of the time, and it almost actually landed you a record deal at a very well-known, but at the time very controversial record company. Would you mind telling us about that?
You mean, well, initially what had happened with the band is we went from here to into New York City, and we were seen at the various clubs around New York. And one place was ironically called The Scene, and we were playing, and the patron there all the time was Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Kramer, and they were working on their records together, and they saw us, and our manager at the time, Marty Angelo, got to be friendly with them, and they wound up speaking and talking, and they heard our band many times, and Jimmy would come in and, kind of hang out and sit in sometimes and all that. But make a long story short, what happened was they told some of the people at CBS Columbia Records that they should look at our band and check us out. And we wound up getting signed to Columbia CBS. At the same time, we were being watched over and touted by George Harrison and Peter Asher when they formed Apple. So that was all going on at the same time. But we did sign with Columbia CBS. Yeah.
In the early 70s, you actually got to work in a myriad of very classic records, such as Van Morrison's Moondance, Jackson Browne's For Every Man, Gene Clark's White Light, and this is just naming a few of them. How did you get in contact with, quite frankly, a very diverse range of artists and groups?
Okay, I'm going to edit, okay? Because this will take an hour. Basically what happened was that summer the band, we were in New York with Raven, and really quickly here I wound up getting a copy of an album that was very pivotal in my life. I heard an album that Van Morrison had made called Astral Weeks. And upon listening to Astral Weeks, I kept listening to it, and after a few weeks went by, I came to the conclusion that this guy's outwriting everybody, and he's gone somewhere where no one has gone with this music. So it connected to me, and ironically, he was a few weeks later he was playing the East Village at a place called the Gaslight Club on McDougal Street, and I found out through some of the people that he would be there, and I went over there, and he had a little kind of a ragtag band, just no drummer, just some percussion, keyboard. He was doing his stuff, and make a long story short, I really offered my services and said I'd love to come in and sit in. And I'm going to edit. And about 3 to 4 months later, we began rehearsing to make Moondance up in Woodstock. And then we recorded that album in New York City. And that's edited. Okay?
So basically a lot of it was just seeing people at venues and getting a hold of them through there?
Yes. Yes, what happened after that, I continued to work with Van, and we started playing around town with the Moondance band, with all the members of that band. And eventually he wound up moving from Woodstock out to San Francisco, and I went out there with him. And then we started on a record called Tupelo Honey, and we made that in San Francisco. And the record became awfully well-known then. And that sort of bought me. I started to venture down into Los Angeles, and that turned into me connecting up with all the other artists, mainly, and Paul Williams, and people you know about, and Jackson Browne, and the Southern California contingent. And that's how it really happened.
Now, around this time, you also became the drummer, backup vocalist, and a co-composer for the Steve Miller Band, and you played on arguably their best known works, Fly Like an Eagle, Abracadabra, The Joker. Do you find there's any real difference between working in a band setting where you're writing with other artists in comparison to working as like a session musician, for example, for like Van Morrison or people of that type?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of difference between all of these composers and all of the writers. When working with Van, that was not a band situation. Those were Van's compositions, and he made some wonderful choices in the band, people that he chose to play on those recording sessions. Whereas with Steve it was a band situation. Although it's the Steve Miller Band and Steve was in control of it, he was the one signed to Capitol Records, and he chose his members. I started working with Steve in 1971. Actually, I was still working with Van Morrison and Paul Williams, same time. So that's your connection. I know you interviewed Paul. So, and I initially did a first album with Steve called A Journey from Eden. We called it Beginning, and then I continued to do more work in Los Angeles, and it wasn't until 74, 75 where he asked me to take on a project that he was going to do, which was, he really wanted to give Pink Floyd a run because of Dark Side of the Moon.
Oh, totally.
So he planned, and then he called me in, and he called his original bass player, Lonnie Turner, in. And we started to attack, and recorded in San Francisco for 2 to 3 weeks. And we were putting together at the time, we didn't know, but we were putting together at the time what became known as the album Fly Like an Eagle. And the second album after that, which was Book of Dreams, which had all of those hits on it, wound up luckily being the hits that carried the band for the next 15 years, right up until we recorded then Abracadabra. And I'll include that question because along the way I had always been writing and composing. But it wasn't until the Abracadabra years, 82, 83, that I showed Steve some of my compositions. And lo and behold, we finished Abracadabra in between my studio and Capitol Records. And that went on to do what it did. And gave us another boost into the atmosphere, up there, So that's how that worked.
Now, as you mentioned, you also worked as a session drummer for a former Studio Kaiju guest, Paul Williams, doing a lot of soundtrack work and a few albums in the mid-'70s. Are there any particular memories from that period that you'd like to share, or working with Paul?
Sure. See, Paul was part of that bank of composers that began to be part of the A&M record company over there in La Cienega Boulevard, the old Charlie Chaplin studios. And Paul was part of that contingent of writers with, there were many of them. Jimmy Webb was involved in that. And I met Paul through several producers and got to perform with Paul live, and then we became his band. And Paul's really a wonderful writer and one of the best gentlemen in the business, and he assured us that if we went out on the road with him and did all his work and his live performances, that we would be included on all of his projects. And the wonderful man kept his word, and I got to do a lot of the motion pictures that he wrote the songs for. So we would go in and we would record the music for motion pictures like Cinderella Liberty and The Man Who Dancing and Bugsy Malone. And then he wound up writing a song called Rainbow Connection, and I wound up being the drummer on the Muppet movie features because of Paul's writing. So that's how that intertwined.
Now I understand you also...